Hello. So, once in a while, when I'm at a dinner party, when people find out what I do for a living, which is study race in higher education, I'll get comments and questions like, what's even the point of diversity? You know, affirmative action is in the news. It seems like schools and universities invest a lot of effort and a lot of money in trying to recruit and retain different types of students, students from racially diverse backgrounds. But I'll hear people ask me, really, what's the point? From what they can see, it seems like when students actually come to college, they actually just tend to, so-called term, self-segregate, clump together, hang out with people who generally are of the same skin tone. Well, today I'll tell you a little bit about how I respond to such intriguing questions at dinner parties, and then also say a little bit about how, while I understand where these questions are coming from, how some of the questions might reflect some certain misconceptions about how race actually works on college campuses, and how people tend to be informed actually by hunches, misconceptions, and something I'll talk about called cognitive bias. And all of that points to the need for us to actually look to facts and data. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about how we can respond to these types of questions and engage in dialogue. All right, so going back to my dinner parties, in terms of when I hear that, since I can say, well, actually, I study that for a living, I can tell them that from the research studies that we have that actually track data sets of thousands and thousands of college students from around the country, contrary to what they might think, students are actually having a high level of engagement with racial diversity during college. And in fact, students of color in particular, the students that I think some of these people think are just sticking to themselves and not branching out, students of color have the highest rates of cross-racial interaction, that is, interaction across racial ethnic lines. They have the highest levels of interracial friendship. At most places, they don't really have a choice. They're constantly interacting across race, whether it's in the residence halls, in their classes, on the intramural field, in other venues. People might think of things like, I think when people ask these types of questions, they have a certain image in their mind. So they might be thinking like, oh, I saw on the news, or I walked by a college campus and I saw that one table of black students who were sitting together. Or maybe I passed by and I saw there's this flyer for an Asian American student organization. Aren't those evidence of that students are really just kind of clumping together? But while I understand where that's coming from, where that misconception is coming from, we tend to overlook sometimes that students, while they spend some time in the cafeteria together, they don't literally camp out in the cafeteria all day. They have multifaceted and very busy lives, right? So they might spend, an hour or two sometimes in the cafeteria with students who might share their same racial ethnic background, and they might go to, say, an Asian American club or a Arab American student club or whatever, but those kinds of activities tend to take up, 1 to couple hours a week, max. And not only that, these venues that seem like they're promoting self-segregation are actually, what the research tells us is they're actually critical because they serve as these recharging stations for our students of color especially. Now, interacting across race, while it's a wonderful thing and certainly essential to the functioning of democracy, can also be somewhat of a taxing experience. It takes energy, it's a great thing, but for students who are doing it all day, like our students of color, they need a place where they can come back and recharge. And what the research shows is that actually, counterintuitively perhaps, participating in those types of clubs, right, say an ethnic student organization, is actually linked with higher rates of interacting across race during college because students can come to these groups, they can refresh a little bit, and then they can go back out and continue to interact across race in healthy and productive ways. Now, I wrote this entire book talking about some of the other myths that, addressing myths, right? And how can we address these myths with actually data and research? But I actually wanted to take a step back and think about, why do people have these myths to begin with, right? Why are people so shaped kind of by what they may have seen on the news, right? And I understand the average person is not sitting around reading academic studies, as enthralling as they are. But what is going on? And I found a lot of answers by exploring a field of research around a concept called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is pioneered in the fields of psychology, behavioral economics. Some prominent scholars include Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman, that you may have heard of. And in a nutshell, the field of research around cognitive bias describes, as one scholar, Dan Ariely, described, that contrary to what we might think about ourselves, we're actually predictably irrational. We like to think we are very logical, that we will look at all the facts and data, look for disconfirming forms of evidence, talk to 10 people. But in reality, our brains are actually wired in a way where we trip ourselves up all the time, and we're swayed very easily by hunches. There's a form of bias called recency bias, where you're actually more likely to believe something if you heard it more recently. Hopefully that'll bode well for this talk towards the end. There's confirmation bias, which you may have heard of, where you're more likely to believe something is true if it confirms something that you already think is true. And there's one of my favorite forms of cognitive bias. You can even Wikipedia, and they'll give you like a long list. They're really interested. Is a form called the availability heuristic, which was pioneered by Tversky and Kahneman. And the availability heuristic describes how we're more likely to believe something is true if it's easily recallable, or if you will, available in our minds, right? And so we're very easily shaped by information that tends to be more recent, frequent, extreme, vivid, etc., because it sticks in our brain. And so it's a funny graphic that shows, here's all of the information, and here's the information that you actually use to make a decision. Or here's all the information, and then here's actually what you see on the local news that freaks you out, right? So we're more likely to have information stick in our brains when it's more easily recallable, makes a kind of strong impression on us. Now, what does that mean for how we think about race on college campuses? Well, I think we tend to see, we might pick up on things that they strike us as unusual, and they tend to stick in our brains, and as a result, that becomes our assumption of how everything works, right, for our particular group, perhaps. So for instance, that example of Black students sitting at the cafeteria, it tends to stick in our brain. And in some ways that can become the defining picture of who Black students are, the idea that they're only sticking with each other, versus seeing Black students the other 23 hours of their days, where they are doing many things with many different types of people. And so really, cognitive bias is really a fascinating term that helps us understand, our status quo is that we're typically on autopilot. We don't think a lot in terms of always looking for, the full range of facts and data. We kind of have to coast to a certain extent. However, that underscores why racial diversity is so critical and important in the first place, right? Because when we can bring different types of people and voices to the table, especially those that are typically not represented, it can do a lot to disrupt that sort of automatic thinking and help us think, hey, I hadn't thought about that in that way, or your perspective is contrary to what I thought it may have been. And those things are actually really good for our development, for the goals that we want our students to have in terms of developing more complex ways of thinking and knowing. So the next time you're at a dinner party, perhaps, and these types of comments come up, you can come back and say, actually, I heard about some research. But also, I think, this entire research around cognitive bias, it really underscores, number one, why research is so critical in the first place, especially in this era of fake news and where we have social media that sometimes acts like an echo chamber. We have algorithms that feed us information that probably feeds into our confirmation bias, right? And so never more, I think, than than before has research been so essential, and also helping communicate research to the public so that they can hopefully have a broader array of information to draw on. And then secondly, really underscoring the importance and criticalness of racial diversity in the first place as something that can take us off autopilot, as something that's critical to the functioning of a diverse society, and something that is, a fundamental part of our role as educators in preparing students for citizenship in a diverse democracy. Thank you.